So there's something about what went wrong with the education system there, because these teachers, all of whom could have taught in Nyanja, but were told by Lusaka headquarters, you teach in English.
Yeah.
We're busy teaching English, and yet at the end of it, when the kids had left school, the outcome was that they were literate in Chinyanja.
I think.
Victor Sims, the Z historian. Now here's a rather intriguing question. Over the years, has the education system in Zambia produced intelligent individuals or simply clever students? What is true intelligence? And is it possible to redefine our education system in a manner that better serves our community?
Which, if you look historically, it came from outside. It wasn't that a group of Zambians decided we want to set up schools. What happened was that foreigners, missionaries from Europe and from America, came to Zambia and they said, we want to teach the people in this part of the world the Word of God.
To help us understand these profound questions is someone who spent years studying intelligence, literacy, and child development in post-colonial Zambia. A professor of psychology, former vice chancellor of the University of Zambia, and award recipient from the Society for Research in Child Development.
My name is Robert Serpell, and I'm 80 years old, so I've had a long life in Zambia. I came to Zambia in 1965, just 1 year after independence. I had grown up in England in a middle-class London family. I had also spent some time at the University of Oxford, which is just outside London. And before going to Oxford, after my high school education, I spent a year in Singapore, which is, as you know, in the Far East, where I encountered a wide range of cultures which I had not been exposed to in my childhood in London. I decided to come to Zambia. I applied for a job right before, at the time when I was graduating from Oxford, and the job was advertised for a research fellow in human development, and it was right at the beginning of UNZA. UNZA, as you know, was an independence project which KK was very proud of. This is a country which has never had a university. We're going to have our own university, and I was privileged to be one of the founding staff. So in 1966, when the first students were admitted to UNZA, I was one of a group of about 10, 15 academic staff. I was one of the youngest, was just 21. And my son was born on the same day that the university admitted its first students. How do I come to feel that it's appropriate to talk about indigenous concepts of intelligence, since I'm an outsider who came to Zambia? I've lived in Zambia most of my adult life. I decided about 5 years after I arrived in Zambia that I didn't want to go back to England. I wanted to become part of Zambian society. So I applied for citizenship, and some years on I was granted citizenship. But apart from the legal side of it, I also married an indigenous Zambian woman, and she and I raised children together, so I became part of Zambian society. I became increasingly unsure of whether the methods that I'd been using in my research, for instance for assessing intelligence, were really appropriate. And so I applied to the university's Research and Grants Committee if I could conduct a study in a rural community where I would try to elicit from parents of children their understanding of what was important as in child development and what their responsibilities as parents were in supporting their children's development. And that study really opened my eyes to a lot of things about child development and intelligence, which I had not learned at Oxford as an undergraduate. the psychology which was offered at British universities didn't really pay much attention to the way African parents raised their children. To the extent that they did at all, they tended to say, well, you know, those Africans who didn't go to school probably don't really have much of an idea how to raise their children. And I discovered that actually where I went, the community that hosted my study in Katete district in Eastern Province, had very clear ideas about how to raise their children, and they were very happy to share them with me. And I realized that the notion of intelligence, the way it's been portrayed in psychology in the Western world, is only very partly connected to the way that the rural community that I was visiting were thinking about children's cognition. So obviously these investigations were done in the local language, which in Katete district is Chichewa. And in Chichewa, if you start off with like a dictionary approach and say, okay, let's see what do they say is the word for intelligence, you'll see it probably says nzelu. But when I talk to people in Katete about their own children and other children in the village, they used a number of words. So kuchenjera was a very common term. And if you want to translate that into English, it's probably closer to clever than to intelligent, right? Whereas nzelu would be perhaps intelligent. So like one of the questions we used to ask was, suppose you go down to the stream where you normally wash your clothes in the stream and then you lay them out to dry, but the place where you normally put them to dry has been soiled by some wild animals. So it's muddy, so you don't want to put the clothes there. And we're asking this question of a mother who is sitting in front of a group of 5 or 6 girls, but not her own daughter. She has a daughter, but we say, let's have just the other children you know in the village. So which of these girls would you choose to go and find a good place to put out the clothes? Okay. Now, they would choose a particular girl, and then, why did you choose this girl? So sometimes they would say, well, she's nzelu, right? Sometimes they would say, she wachenjera. And sometimes they would say something different, like, ni watumikira. Watumikira is a child who can be sent, right? And if you think about who can be sent, the sort of underlying concept really is she's responsible. You can trust her. And sometimes they would say she's trustworthy. Part of the history of education, not only in Zambia, but in many parts of Africa, is that it was brought by religious missionaries. And what the missionaries didn't acknowledge in those early days of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century was that they were bringing a package, some of which was to do with religion and some of which had really nothing to do with religion at all. Like, for instance, okay, you're going to teach a child to read because you want them to understand the Bible. But this is a little fellow, he's like 6 or 7 years old, so you're not going to start right away on philosophy. You just got to get him to be able to read the text. Which text? Well, most of the missionaries in Zambia actually said, well, we use the language that the people speak. But then they found that many of the communities, in fact, I think it's true to say all of the communities in Zambia, or in what became Zambia, back in the 19th century, didn't have a writing system. So what the missionaries did said, oh, well, if we want to teach the Word of God and we want to teach people to read, we have to have their language written down. And so they became linguists. And so all of the dictionaries, some of these dictionaries I have up here, the first dictionaries of Zambian languages were written by missionaries because they became, you know, they were, how do you spell kuchenjera? How do you spell nzelu, right? And so they used the alphabet, which their language, some of them were French, some of them were German, some of them were English, but all of those languages use the same alphabet, which comes from the Latin of the first millennium. And so they imposed that writing system on the indigenous languages, which they were learning from their hosts, right? The hosts that they were trying to convert were teaching them how to speak Chinyanja, or Ichibemba, or Chitonga, or Silozi, and then they would listen and they would say, okay, say that again, and then they would write it down and they would develop a writing system. That writing system was committing a language to writing in a very different way from the way in which French and German and English were committed to writing. The Latin alphabet was devised to fit those languages. There are some odd things about the way in which the alphabet is reflected in Zambian languages. So, for instance, the letter B makes the sound B in English, but in Ichibemba, it makes that sound V, right? And in Chinyanja, the letter B makes the sound B, like in English, but they have the sound of V, and they write that sound with a W. So Chicheva and Ichibemba are spelled with a B in Bemba and with a W in Chinyanja or Chicheva. One of the reasons why some children find it really difficult to learn to read is because the writing system is not ideally suited to the way they speak. By the time they're 7, they come to school, they already speak fluent Chinyanja or Chivamba. But now they've got to learn how to read it, and the way it's written, it may be part of that, of what makes it difficult. There's a phenomenon which actually, paradoxically, only arose after independence. When Zambia attained independence in 1964, all of the primary schools were teaching first graders to read in one of the Zambian languages. But they decided in 1966 to introduce what they called the English medium scheme. And so the first Zambian indigenous Minister of Education, John Manakatwe, said, the cabinet has approved, this is now government policy, all teachers are required to teach first graders to read in English, not in their mother tongue. And that policy went on for 30 years or so. It's been revised in the last 20, 30 years. And I believe that one of the things which has to be thought through by Zambian educators is how does the concept of nzelu, for instance, or mano in Bemba, how does that relate to the goals of education? You know, one of the stories which I often tell is the story of the girl that I call Gillian, who actually gave up on schooling after she'd been at school for 4 years, said, I'm not getting anything out of schooling. We thought maybe the family had taken her out of school because they wanted her to get married. And they said, no, we didn't. She said she didn't want to go to school, and we thought we're not going to force her. So let her tell you. So they called her, and she, in front of this crowd of visitors, said, look, I wasn't learning anything at school. When he asked Gillian, okay, so you say you can read, can you read in Nyanja? She said, yes. Can you read in English? No, not really. Okay. And you say you're not in school and you haven't been in school for a couple of years. How did you learn to read Chinyanja? So, my mum taught me. And I thought this should be an interesting mother, you know, if she can teach her. Not very many rural mothers teach their children to read. Eh? So right away at the beginning of the interview, we asked her, is it true that you taught Gillian how to read? Yes. Okay, that's interesting. So how did it come about? I mean, was that your idea or hers? No, she said she used to come to church with me, and one day she said to me, Mum, I can't read the prayer books, but you read them. Can you teach me how to do that? So I went back to my house, and in my things stored away from long ago, I had the little exercise books that they used when I was in school, which is 20, 30 years ago. Yeah. And I used those to teach her. And it's very interesting. So how long did it take you Oh, she caught on quite fast, maybe 2 months, 3 months. Okay, so in 3 months, this mother who herself had done sub A, sub B, grade 1, grade 2, and had stopped, was able to teach her daughter to read. But earlier in the daughter's life, for 4 years, she was enrolled in a school with professional teachers and a curriculum and everything, and she learned, as she said, nothing. And to teach your child as you're growing up to be wochenjera. It's also important to teach your child to be wotumikila, and it's very important for them to try to become nzelu. So my colleague Chikomeni Banda, who was a UNZA student and went on to do a master's degree at UNZA, wrote a kind of text for the community about this, and he said the title of the text was nzelu Nindani, and the question which he used the answers to focus the rest of the text was, which is more important for nzelu, to be wochenjera or to be wotumikila? Well, the answer we got was almost in every case, you can't choose. They're both important. To be nzelu, a child must be both wochenjera and wotumikila. So, one example which I thought was very illuminating from a parent answering this question, she said, if the child is wochenjera, but he's not wotumikila, he might become a thief, right? He's only used that cleverness all for himself. He's not going to pay attention to what other people care, right? Well, we don't want to raise our children to be thieves. We want them to be responsible people. And responsibility, the nearest translation I can give it is wotumikila. And I think that insight that children can be clever in a manipulative way, which is not the desirable outcome of education, or they can use their cleverness to achieve things which are socially responsible. That's what education should be about.